Here's what you need to understand when it comes to hormones and fat loss, especially when working with menopausal or perimenopausal clients. Changes in hormones will impact where clients store and lose fat, the ratios of macronutrients they should be consuming, and energy levels, sleep, and stress, making it more difficult to lose weight, but not impossible, especially if you know and understand the right strategies. And let me show you how to do just that, starting with some of the common problems your clients might face and the strategies to solve them. Let's start with number 1, abdominal and belly fat. If you want to help menopausal clients lose belly fat, you need to understand that their nutrition and exercise needs change. Because the things that worked in the past, normal healthy meals with plenty of carbohydrates, different forms of exercise, longer duration cardio, and even more intense forms of exercise aren't working anymore. And if anything, they're actually making the situation worse. And you don't have to look very far to see some strategies like fasting and the ketogenic diet being pushed as the answer. But they don't. And here's the kicker, especially for my science-fueled, evidence-based nutrition coaches out there. All of these changes to weight gain and belly fat can happen independent of energy balance. It happens without that. So what can and should be done nutrition-wise? In general, and I use that term liberally, some menopausal clients can benefit from the following changes: slightly less carbohydrate and more protein and fat. One of the main changes here is reducing carbohydrate intake, and I'm going to tell you why in a second. But I would suggest trying to start carbohydrates at the highest level you can while still seeing some results. The goal isn't to be on a low carbohydrate diet, which is typically defined as less than 25% of calories coming from carbohydrate, or roughly less than 130 grams per day, but is closer to moderate carbohydrate, with the difference being made up from higher protein and anti-inflammatory fat sources. Carb choices should ideally be mainly fiber containing, coming from fruit, vegetable, whole grain, rice, potato, stuff like that. Really trying to emphasize whole food sources and staying away from anything that's overly processed or added sugar. And again, what I recommend is starting with the highest level of carbohydrate possible that still allows for weight loss. For many, this would be around 1.5 to 2.0 grams per kilogram of carbohydrate per day, with the rest of the macronutrients being closer to 1.5 to 1.8 grams per kilogram of protein per day, and fat being closer to 0.8 to 1.0 grams per kilogram per day. And all those values are in grams per kilogram of body weight. And again, that's a suggestion and everyone is different, so it takes some tracking and adjustment to find those right levels. But you also don't want to go too low carb, even if theoretically that could be helpful. This is due to the impact that it may have on cortisol levels as hormonal changes occur. So in summary, what is being shown in the science and also what's working practically is a moderate carbohydrate, higher protein, and moderate fat macro breakdown. We'll talk a little bit more about protein intake when I go over exercise recommendations later in the video, especially as it pertains to muscle gain. But for now, let me tell you why I'm making these nutrition recommendations. One of the most common complaints, or at least observations, from female clients over the age of 40 is where they store fat. Going from what we would consider a more female type body fat pattern to a more male-like body fat pattern, which means gaining fat around the midsection or belly, which will be new for many. Especially in the past, if they had gained weight, it would be around the lower body. And the main reason here is due to changes in insulin sensitivity. And if you worked with female clients in their 40s or 50s, they probably express something like this. Let me know if it sounds familiar. And I'm reading these because they're not my words. These are the comments that have come way of nutrition applications over the years. These stupid love handles just won't go away no matter what I do, or I don't feel like myself anymore. I feel heavy, sluggish, and this isn't a body that I know, or even I'm starting to look like my mother. Sound familiar? It's a really common situation, and although these changes are happening, it doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do to control them. The belly fat situation happens for a few reasons, but it's mainly related to hormonal changes. And I'm going to spend some time explaining these changes because it's going to play into everything that we're seeing here. Not only a higher likelihood of belly fat gain, but also general weight gain and changes in hunger, energy levels, mood, and cravings. And here's how it happens. As women approach menopause, there's going to be a decrease in estrogen and progesterone, the main female sex hormones. To put these hormones into context for a second here, so just like women have around 7% of the total amount of testosterone that men have only around 10% of the level of estrogen and progesterone that females have. Now, also keep in mind when we're talking about these hormonal changes and their symptoms, it's hard to say what they're from. Is it because of the hormonal changes, or is it because of aging? because there's often overlap in the symptoms. But either way, these changes have a profound impact on female physiology, especially when it comes to fat storage, as well as some other important parameters like energy and hunger levels that we'll discuss later in the video. A simple way of thinking about estrogen and progesterone is thinking of them generally like opposites. They have opposite impacts on a woman's physiology, but they also work together synergistically to determine those impacts, and with the ultimate goal of preparing the body for a pregnancy. And although they fluctuate during the normal menstrual cycle, when they specifically decrease during menopause, we start to see some of these symptoms, unless you have the right strategies in place to mitigate them. So let me show you how. I could save you from all the textbook definitions here, but I won't, because it's important to define them so we're all on the same page. So the textbook definition for menopause is once a woman has not had a menstrual cycle for 12 months, at this point, she's considered to have entered menopause, and this is marked by a drop in estrogen and progesterone levels and then slight increase in testosterone levels. And this is a bit of a generalization, but this puts them into essentially a luteal-like physiology. Now, if you're not familiar with the normal menstrual cycle, which I am only on paper, bear with me a second. This luteal phase is typically the last 14 days in the normal menstrual cycle. This occurs from ovulation onwards, and we start to see a rise in both progesterone and estrogen, with progesterone being the most dominant in this phase, which is not the case in the other phase, which is the follicular phase, or the first 14 days. Its effect there is almost non-existent. But what this luteal-like phase does in menopause is that it creates a prolonged decrease in insulin sensitivity, as well as an increase in fat storage, hunger, and decrease in energy levels. And as you may have guessed, this is the perfect storm for weight gain. But there are things that your clients can do and you can suggest to manage this, like reducing carbohydrate intake and increasing protein intake, like we already talked about. But there's also the phase that leads up to this, and that's called perimenopause. Perimenopause simply means nearing menopause, and it refers to the transition into menopause itself. This is thought to occur in the 50s, although it's possible for women to enter perimenopause in their 40s or even late 30s. And this is outside of medical conditions where they could enter forced menopause at any age. The only true marker of these changes can be assessed through blood work, and in perimenopause, estrogen levels can shift up and down, while progesterone typically decreases overall. Now, many researchers and experts refer to this entire period, both periods we just discussed, as menopause, which is commonly accepted. And it's important to realize here the only change isn't just insulin resistance. Changes in hormones will have impact on cortisol levels and therefore stress, so let's dive into that by talking about some of these other symptoms like sleep, fatigue, stress, mood, and hunger. One of the shifts that starts happening around that perimenopausal period is the decrease in progesterone. Ovulation starts to become less frequent, so the effects of progesterone are less seen, which can be in many cases thought as a hormone that helps with the parasympathetic nervous system response, or rest and recovery. So without progesterone, we start to see an increase in some of these stress effects. One of the biggest changes being a change in sleep quality and sleep patterns that aren't sleep hygiene related. And these are typically due to higher levels of cortisol and a stress response. Now, it's a good time to point out that cortisol doesn't always automatically mean bad. In normal situations, cortisol actually helps us mobilize energy to deal with stress. It's helpful, it's normal, it's what wakes you up in the morning. But when it's chronically elevated, that's when it starts to become problematic. And we start to see it impact all of those other symptoms like sleep and hunger levels and energy and cravings. And as you can imagine, if there's disturbances to that, it's going to make adhering to any sort of nutrition or exercise program really difficult. Meaning without the right strategies and parameters in place, this typically leads to weight gain. So what can be done? There's a few things actually, starting with number one, which is weight loss. This may seem a bit redundant because this situation typically leads to weight gain, but maintaining a healthy body weight or losing some weight can be helpful. In a study called the Women's Health Initiative, which observed 17,000 postmenopausal women through time, found that women that lost 10 pounds or at least 10% of their body weight and kept it off for at least a year were able to eliminate hot flashes or night sweats. So weight loss, which is obviously in the wheelhouse of a nutrition coach, especially with the information that you're learning today, can be helpful. But there's also number two, which are restorative practices. Rest and recovery practices can be helpful to minimize stress. Obviously easier said than done in the modern world, but restorative practices like yoga and meditation and being outdoors can reduce stress, which will reduce cortisol levels, as well as low intensity exercise like walking, which we're going to detail next. But the intent of these recovery practices is to lower cortisol, which will essentially mimic like there's estrogen and progesterone around. Now, one variable that can be relaxing depending on the context is alcohol consumption. And since I know many clients, both female and male, are going to ask this question, can I drink alcohol? I thought I'd address it. So it's well documented that chronic alcohol consumption will increase cortisol levels. And although there's nothing inherently wrong with drinking alcohol, it's not black and white. If the priority in this period is to manage those symptoms, it may be best to avoid it. Now keep in mind here, we're actually not doing anything to balance hormones, and that's a phrase that gets tossed around a lot because it doesn't really work like that, especially not without medical intervention. But there are things that you can do to work with these changes and lessen some of the symptoms. And if your clients can better control these symptoms, they're more likely to stick to whatever nutrition and exercise program they're trying to follow. With that being said, and we're going to touch on this next, anything that you do that will increase the cortisol response or stress response, we're talking aggressive calorie deficits or extremely low carbohydrate diets or anything that's really aggressive in terms of dietary restraint, can be counterproductive. The old saying less is more is definitely true here, so let's talk about that as we dive into exercise. Here's what happens when most people, women included, want to improve their health. They get all fired up to change and they want to make drastic changes to their nutrition and exercise. They go into boot camp mode and they start to do super intense, long duration classes and start to cut out anything they actually enjoy eating. As you're probably starting to realize, this can be counterproductive. This is problematic and it actually backfires given the hormonal changes. It makes things worse. And this isn't just a client thing, it's a coaching thing as well. Putting clients on a way too aggressive protocol right from the beginning without really paying much attention to the hormonal situation. Here's what is helpful though. Let's start with number one, weightlifting. Resistance training is pretty much non-negotiable. If there's any age or gender group that would benefit from lifting weights, it's this one, which is somewhat ironic because this is typically or classically the type of person that would avoid it. And I've personally seen this firsthand. When I first started lifting weights in 2003, the weight room was essentially all dudes. And it was unfortunate and sad, and I'm so glad to see that change because weightlifting or resistance training has so many benefits. For starters, it helps to build muscle, but more importantly, especially in females, it's actually been shown to burn visceral and belly fat, which isn't seen in men. And not only that, weight-bearing exercise will help to improve bone health, which is problematic in this age group as well. For all those reasons, it's important to include weight training around 2 to 3 sessions per week, emphasizing heavier loads in that 6 to 10 rep range. So what else is helpful though for exercise? We also have number 2, super low intensity exercise. Other types of exercise that are on the complete opposite end of the spectrum can also be helpful. We're talking low intensity movement like walking. Most will benefit from around 8 to 12,000 steps per day, but if this seems daunting at first, just start to add in 500 to 1,000 more steps from their baseline. And double down on this time by doing something relaxing, by listening to something that's inspirational or informational, or even focusing on guided breathing exercises. We also have number 3 here, which is exercise nutrition. Protein around the workout period is going to be very important for your menopausal clients. Ideally, they're consuming anywhere between 15 to 20 grams of protein for weight training or exercise to help support some of those muscular adaptations. And afterwards, the dose should be even larger, somewhere between 30 to 40 total grams of protein. This will help properly stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which is going to be a little bit different in this hormonal situation. So make sure they're consuming around 30 to 40 grams of total protein after their workouts, especially their weight training workouts, fitting this into optimal daily protein totals. Phew, and there you have it, guys. That is the Nutrition Coach's Guide to Menopause and Perimenopause. We covered a lot of information here and we just scratched the surface, so stay tuned for another video further discussing this stuff. And I do want to summarize with this. This is a new and exciting area serving a very underserved client population. But although there are going to be some hormonal changes in this period, just getting our female clients to be more mindful of their nutrition and exercise can sometimes be enough to create some change. So don't get overwhelmed with this stuff because that in itself can be the difference maker. Now, as great as all these tips are, if you're really serious about starting a nutrition coaching business, the next thing I'll have you do is check out this video I've linked up right here. I'm going to explain to you the complete science of gut health, so don't miss it. Check out the video right here.